Thank you, as always, for choosing to spend your time here. I wish you a truly good day ahead, with more peace in your heart and more good moments than you expected. If this channel means something to you, please subscribe, like the video, leave a comment, and share it with your loved ones. And now, let us go straight into the story. Helios Recovery Complex circled Earth on a slow medical orbit, bright on one side and shadowed on the other. It had been built for the long work that began after speeches ended. Adrianne Solis knew every wing of the station well enough to tell what kind of day it would be from the sounds in the transfer corridor. When the complex ran smoothly, the air carried a clean rhythm of lift carts, therapy rails, and clipped conversation. When pressure was coming, small delays multiplied until people stopped speaking in full sentences. That morning, before the first treatment block had even started, she heard too many doors opening and closing too fast. She was the Earth Rehabilitation Administrator, and the title sounded clean on paper. In practice, it meant she spent most of her life standing between wounded people and systems that kept finding new ways to call them expensive. She was in the lower neural ward because John Merrick was scheduled to leave for Titan Yard within the hour. He had lost the use of both legs during the siege of Dorsa Array after staying inside a compromised filtration spine long enough to keep breathable air moving through a mixed residential block. He needed another neural lattice procedure if he was ever going to stand without support, and Titan Yard was one of only 3 places in Earth space that could still do it. John sat on the edge of a brace bench with his transport papers in one hand and a careful look on his face. Adrianne had learned to distrust that look. Hope made people careful when they had been disappointed too many times. "Did they clear the travel gate?" he asked. "They cleared it yesterday," Adrianne said. "That is not the same thing." "No," she said. "It is not." She was not going to lie to him. She had stopped doing that early in her career after learning that false reassurance made institutions feel gentle while the people under them still got hurt. Across the room, Dr. Celine Ward finished speaking to a therapist over a treatment schedule she already knew by heart. Celine had kept a field hospital open for 8 days during the Rin border collapse, treating Earth civilians, Allied crews, and alien children with chemical burns while the triage generators failed around her. Now she lived with permanent nerve damage along her hands and spine, and the new policy review had suddenly marked her support plan excessive. Beyond her, in a vocational bay behind a clear partition, Mina Torv stood beside a line of diagnostic rigs waiting for final approval to return to technical service. Mina had spent the war as a civilian reactor engineer. She had stayed inside a failing station core long enough to hold output steady for 3 evacuation docks, then survived with lung scarring so severe that she could not climb unassisted. The work board had just told her she was now a productivity risk. Captain Elias Rowe was not in the ward yet. He had gone down to records before dawn after another bad cycle of fragmented memory. Elias had commanded a defensive shield line over Meridian Expanse and taken a blast that stopped a breach from reaching 5 transport carriers. He still knew what he had done. What he had lost was his confidence that his own mind would stay arranged in the right order long enough for anyone else to trust him. All 4 of them were on Adrianne's morning list. All 4 had passed through systems that said the right things about gratitude every year on memorial dates. All 4 were about to learn how quickly gratitude changed once budgets were involved. A junior mobility officer crossed the ward at a half run and handed Adrianne a slate without a word. She read the header once, then again, not because she had missed it, but because disbelief often needed a second look to become anger. It was a provisional implementation notice from the Interstellar Recovery Insurance Board, effective immediately. Not in 3 days, not after review, not after challenge. Immediately. The burden classification had been moved forward. Adrianne scrolled through the text. The language was technical, but the sequence was simple once you stripped the polish away. First, movement privileges were suspended pending benefit tier reassessment. Then treatment continuity would be audited under a revised efficiency model. Then vocational reentry approvals would be held. After that, reimbursement exposure would be recalculated under modified war impact status. It was all written in dry, balanced language. That made it worse. Systems almost always harmed people with their calmest words. Administrator, the mobility officer said. John was watching her now. So was Celine. They did not need the slate to know bad news when it arrived. Adrianne handed the slate back. Who has the implementation list? She asked. Records is still syncing the branches. They say some files are already locked. Locked by whom? Board relay and local liaison. That is all they told us. John had not looked away from her face. It is me, isn't it? He asked. Adrianne held his gaze. Yes. His mouth tightened once. He did not ask why. People who had lived long in damaged bodies understood that why usually came after someone more powerful had already decided. Celine took a slow step closer. Mine too. Adrianne nodded. Mina put a hand on the clear partition as if steadying herself. The therapist beside her lowered his eyes before Adrianne could even speak, which meant the answer had reached that station first. A treatment manager opened a separate line on Adrianne's wrist unit. We have a cascade, the manager said. Orthopedic, pulmonary, neuro, all of it. The new burden bands are cutting across wards. We need instruction. That was the real shape of a crisis. Not the document itself, but the moment ordinary staff needed someone to tell them whether they were still allowed to do what their work had taught them was right. Nothing stops until I say it stops, Adrianne answered. Continue all live preparations. Freeze outbound cancellations. Mirror every affected file to internal archive before the lock spread. Can we do that? We can copy our own records until someone physically stops us. She closed the line and looked around the ward. John's transport chair. Celine's treatment map. Mina's work clearance. 4 real lives inside one policy label. Thousands more behind them. Helios Recovery Complex existed for exactly this reason. Wars did not end when the shooting stopped. They ended when enough people with power decided the survivors had become inconvenient. Adrianne turned back to the mobility officer. Give me the full implementation tree. I want ward by ward, privilege by privilege, and the name of whoever signed local compliance. The officer hesitated. There's a caution note. It says any interference with rollout may trigger cross-sector review. Good, Adrianne said. Then we will know who wants this scene. The ward had shown her the damage. Records would show her how the damage had been made official. She left the lower ward and moved into the central administrative spine with long, measured steps that made younger staff instinctively clear the corridor. She was not dramatic by nature. When she became quiet, people around her learned to respect it. The next step was obvious. If the crisis had begun in the ward, the trail would lead through records. That was where administrative harm stopped sounding abstract and started taking legal shape inside real files. At the intersection outside records, she found Elias Rowe standing in front of a public terminal, one hand braced on the screen frame, reading his own file as if it belonged to someone else. Elias, she said. He turned. They changed my mobility status. I know. They changed my memory evaluation category too. Adrianne took the slate from his hand. His file now read managed civic dependency, adjusted service relevance, restricted transport discretion. It was the bureaucratic version of stripping someone in public. They say I can still attend supervised therapy in local zone rotation, Elias said. That means they want me near enough to monitor and too far from anything important to matter. You still matter. That is generous language for a day like this. He was trying to sound dry. The effort cost him. Adrianne gave him the truth he could use. This did not happen because you failed recovery. It happened because they changed the framework, and they changed it early. Now they're letting the new category do the damage before anyone can challenge it. I need you steady. Can you do that? He breathed out once, slowly. For work, yes. That was why she trusted him. Not because he was unbroken, but because he knew exactly how much of himself he could promise. Inside records, the implementation damage was spreading faster than even Adrianne had expected. Multiple branches of the Earth post-war recovery system had already received external lock instructions. Files were being rerouted into a new status tree that changed their meaning before anyone local could challenge it. One by one, lies were being translated into cost problems. Vera Kellen, Chief Records Supervisor for Helios, met Adrianne with a face set too hard. They pushed the burden class before the central notice window, Vera said. It came through the board and the local council liaison at the same time. How many files? Still counting. Low thousands at Helios. More across Earth orbit and the colonial care chain. How much did they alter? Vera handed her a line printout. Movement, treatment priority, vocational eligibility, reimbursement status. Some war-linked injury tags are already flagged for status normalization. Adrianne looked up sharply. Normalization to what? To post-conflict burdens rather than war-affected citizens. There was the first true blade beneath the paperwork. War-affected citizens still implied obligation. Burden population implied management. Who approved local compliance? Adrianne asked. Vera named him without disguising her contempt. Luros Ven, Recovery Board Liaison. Adrianne already knew the name. Loras Ven specialized in appearing practical while making cruelty sound like arithmetic. She sent 3 instructions at once. 1 to freeze internal outbound cancellations. 1 to Earth Medical Logistics to hold all transport lanes scheduled before the new classification could harden. 1 to the Office of Rehabilitation Law to prepare an emergency contest. Then she told Vera to pull every file affected in the first wave and sort them into service category, injury type, and war liability relevance. Why war? Liability relevance? Vera asked. Because they did not move this early just to save transport slots. A shadow fell over the records door. Loras Van had arrived under council seal, flanked by 2 administrative monitors who looked like they wished they were elsewhere. Vin was a narrow man with patient eyes and the polished restraint of someone who had spent his career telling suffering people there were regrettable constraints. He offered Adrianne the polite nod he used whenever he expected to survive a room by sounding more reasonable than anyone else in it. Administrator Solis, he said, I was coming to brief you. You were coming to enforce compliance. The distinction may be emotional rather than practical. No, Adrianne said. The distinction is moral. I assume that is why it disappeared from your paperwork. Vera lowered her head slightly to hide what might have become a smile. Then ignored it. The board advanced implementation because post-war exposure has become unsustainable across multiple sectors. Earth was notified of the broader review. Earth was notified of review, Adrianne said. Not same-day execution. The acceleration was lawful under burden harmonization rules. Lawful for whom? For the system as a whole. Adrianne stepped closer, not enough to threaten him, just enough to make him choose whether to retreat. He did not. John Merrick loses the surgery route that gives him a chance to stand. Celine Ward loses treatment continuity for nerve damage sustained while keeping a mixed field hospital alive. Elias Rowe loses transport rights because his memory now makes him an efficiency concern. Mina Torv loses work clearance after stabilizing a reactor chain that powered evacuations across 3 species. Which one of those is the system you mean? Ven did not blink. The board does not evaluate worth. It evaluates sustainable care distribution. That answer would embarrass a machine. One of the monitors shifted uncomfortably. Ven kept his tone level. I understand your attachment to these cases. Attachment. Adrianne stored the word away. Men like him always revealed themselves more clearly when they thought they were softening a blow. My attachment, she said, is to the idea that people who carried war into their bodies do not become a residual class because your ledgers ran out of courage. Ven raised his slate. If Earth obstructs the rollout, the board will note non-compliance and forward it to oversight. Good, Adrianne said. Right clearly. He left without another word. That was one of the ugliest strengths of power. It could move on before damage had even finished registering in the people it touched. By midday, the first count from Helios alone had crossed 3,000 affected files. Across Earth orbit and colonial recovery nodes, the number would be many times higher. At that point, the crisis was already larger than treatment access on one station. The files had shown her that. Records had shown her the damage inside the files. The next step was to follow the same damage into policy. She left records and took the lift to the policy conference ring because the fight had already moved beyond medicine. Now it was about money, liability, and what Earth would be pressured to accept in exchange for relief. That level of the complex was cleaner, quieter, and more dangerous than the wards. Human pain became decisions there, and decisions later returned to the wards wearing official seals. Deputy Minister Corin Vale from Earth Reconstruction was waiting with 2 finance officers and 1 legal advisor. Corin was not Adrianne's enemy. That made the meeting harder. He gestured toward the sealed room. "We need to speak privately." They entered a small chamber overlooking Earth through polarized glass. The view had been designed to calm negotiations. Adrianne had always found that insulting. Corin did not waste time. "There's an offer on the table," he said. "Not public, not final, but real. There's always an offer on the table when someone wants Earth to swallow shame quickly." He let that pass. The reconstruction finance bloc will consider debt extension, reduced short-term pressure, and restored access to medical imports if Earth accepts the stabilization package. Say the real name. He hesitated. Reconstruction Stabilization Compact. That is the clean name. Say the real. One of the finance officers glanced down. Corin's face hardened by a degree. The compact includes acceptance of burden classification under pilot terms. There it is. It also pauses several pending liability contests while the system recalculates post-war obligations. Adrianne let the sequence settle before she answered. First, they changed the classification. Then that new classification changed travel, treatment, work access, and status. Once status changed, liability changed with it. And once liability changed, someone else paid less. Meaning Earth gets breathing room now. If Earth agrees that the wounded can be recoded and certain war debts can go soft. Corin folded his hands. Meaning Earth avoids a fiscal break that could damage everyone, including the people you were trying to protect. There was no point pretending the argument was cheap. It was strong precisely because it had some truth in it. Earth had come out of the war alive, not healthy. Reconstruction debt was real. Import strain was real. The price of refusing this offer would also be paid by citizens, including those Adrianne served. That was what made systems like this dangerous. They did not ask you to choose between good and evil. They asked you to decide which part of your own conscience you were willing to amputate first. What happens, Adrianne asked, to the war-affected status of the people already reclassified? They would remain under the new framework, pending review. What happens to the old liability chains linked to their injuries? The legal advisor answered this time. Those chains would be subject to harmonization. Harmonization, Adrianne repeated, another elegant word for making the invoice smaller. Corin stepped near the table. Adrianne, listen to me. Earth is stretched. Colonies are still rebuilding. Medical supply corridors are thin. Public patience is thinner. If we reject this outright, we may save a principle and lose material ground we actually need. She knew he believed that. She also knew what he could not admit aloud in a room that recorded everything. If Earth accepted, the people under the new burden class would pay that debt extension in flesh. Pain and lost futures. Cora met her eyes. You were asked here because the government needs your assessment. No, Adrianne said. I was asked here because you need someone with my title to help make this look survivable. The room went still. One of the finance officers finally spoke, a woman with careful hands and a voice that had probably learned caution young. It may still be survivable, she said. For whom? Adrianne asked. No one answered. She left the conference ring with one thing clearer than before. The burden framework was not a side effect of post-war policy. It was part of trade. Offer the wounded less. Call the discount stability. Ask the survivors to be grateful. When she came back down to Helios' lower ring, the damage was easier to see in faces than in documents. Families had begun arriving in greater numbers. They were not dramatic. Most bureaucratic violence did not create dramatic scenes. It created people holding printouts in corridors, reading the same lines 3 times because the first 2 made no moral sense. A father from South Meridian Colony wanted to know why his daughter had lost movement clearance for burn reconstruction after 3 years of compliance. A woman whose husband had worked shield maintenance during the war wanted to know how he could be called a burden when the same government still showed his image at remembrance ceremonies. A former convoy pilot stood against the wall and read his own service history with a new classification laid over it, as though someone had written across his life in a different hand. Adrianne stopped for each one because that was still her work. She could not promise reversal. She could promise clarity. By late cycle, she had made enough calls to learn the rollout was not limited to Earth orbit. Colonial systems under mixed insurance exposure were already beginning their own reclassification waves. That meant the crisis had been built to outrun local resistance before local resistance could organize. It also meant someone had been preparing it long before Earth saw the formal notice. The problem was no longer Helios alone. Helios was simply where Adrianne could still see the bodies behind. The wording. That night, with the local picture clear enough to act on, she moved into the internal audit suites on Helios Lower Administration. If the lower ring had shown the harm, the audit suite would have to show how the harm had been built. She built the kind of war room she hated. Quiet, windowless, and full of people pretending information could be separated from human bodies. Vera Kellen pulled cross-index files. Elias Rowe reviewed service chains where memory gaps did not touch his strategic eye. Celine Ward contributed treatment histories from those now flagged unsustainable. Mina Torv, still denied vocational clearance, sat at a systems table and dissected the metadata paths of the rollout, as if rebuilding an engine. Near second shift, John Merrick wheeled himself into the suite uninvited. "You are supposed to be resting," Adrianne said. "I lost my travel window," he answered. "This is rest now." No one argued with that. They worked in layers. First, they needed to know whether the rollout had been chaotic or designed. Then they needed to know who benefited if it held. It was Mina who found the first crack. The implementation tree had been seeded through budget review nodes 3 weeks before official notice. Elias followed the routing and found the nodes touched 2 separate clusters: insurance burden review and reconstruction debt adjustment. Vera overlaid the affected files and discovered they were not random at all. They concentrated around people with long treatment trajectories, public service records, and injuries tied to campaigns where liability remained politically sensitive. Celine looked over the list for a long time before speaking. "They are not cutting the least recoverable," she said quietly. "They are cutting the most inconvenient." That sentence clarified everything in the room. By dawn, Adrianne had the beginning of a case. Not a public victory, and not enough to stop the machine, but enough to stop pretending the burden class was merely technocratic. She stood by the audit room door, while Earth turned slowly beyond the complex hull, and let herself think of her brother, Tomas Solis, for exactly 30 seconds. Tomas had served as a systems engineer during the Karen evacuations. He had survived the war and died 5 years later because his pulmonary reconstruction had been delayed, downgraded, then moved to a lower priority lane under an earlier efficiency reform. No one called him a burden to Adrianne's face. The system did not need to. It had already done the work. She returned to the room and gave the first real order of the night. "We are not arguing compassion," she said. "We are proving design." That changed the posture of everyone around the table. Until then, they had been defending the wounded. Now, they were hunting the mechanism. The next 2 days gave them more evidence and more enemies. Before the summons arrived, Adrianne learned again how policy reached the body through humiliation. A civilian dock rescuer named Pavel Neris arrived at Helios with one arm in a support shell and a travel denial in his hand. His shoulder reconstruction had failed twice. The third procedure required a joint weave available only off-station. The burden order did not deny it outright. It pushed him into conditional review and a local substitute lane with a waiting list long enough to function as refusal. "I do not want to take resources from someone more urgent," he told Adrianne. "You are not taking anything," she said. He showed her the notice. Limited strategic recovery value. Deferred prosthetic competitiveness. That was the lie hidden inside the framework. It did not only decide who was worth treating. It decided whose future still counted as work rather than upkeep. After Pavel left, Adrianne told Vera to add one more tracking column to the affected files. For what? Vera asked. For future capacity removed. If they deny support first, then point to decline later, I want the pattern on record. That was how these systems fed themselves. First, they narrowed support. Then they measured the damage they caused and called it data. By early evening, Helios had become more than a medical complex. It had become a waiting room for a social question no one had intended to ask openly. How much usefulness did a damaged citizen need to show before civilization remembered it still owed them? Loyalty? The answer from the burden framework was cruelly simple. More than most wounded people could afford to prove twice. By then, the investigation had outgrown care policy alone. The next pressure point came from labor. If the same category could be used against injured workers after war-linked service, then this was not only about benefits. It was about status, labor, and who could be made cheaper after danger had passed. A delegation from the Orbital Recovery Guild requested a closed meeting with Adrianne. They represented station repair crews, salvage teams, post-war rebuild engineers, and civilian maintenance workers who had taken military-grade risks because someone had to keep habitable systems functioning while official chains failed. Their president, Dahlia Kern, arrived with 6 pages of names and no time for ceremonial language. If this class holds, Dahlia said, laying the list on Adrianne's table, half the people who rebuilt our docks will become optional citizens. That is the argument I am making. No, Dahlia said. So far you're making a care argument. I am telling you this is a labor argument too. She pointed at the list. Welders with spinal damage. Atmosphere mechanics with chronic lung loss. Debris pilots with neural impairment. Water stack teams with tissue burns. People no longer at full output, which meant they would be the first to disappear from any recovery model that counted performance before death. Dahlia was not sentimental and did not pretend to be. I do not need the council to love our injured, she said. I need them to fear the precedent. If they can downcode workers after war exposure, they can do it after industrial disasters, radiation leaks, containment failures, anything expensive enough. Adrianne leaned back. That was the missing external pressure she had needed. Will the guild say that publicly? Dahlia gave her a hard look. Only if Earth stops pretending this is still an internal policy correction. The next day, the guild said it publicly. That changed the shape of the fight again. What had started as a medical and records battle now moved into labor, public legitimacy, and the story the wider system would tell. About injured citizens. Burden classification was no longer framed only as a dispute about benefits. It became a dispute about whether the largest systems in the galaxy were preparing to strip wounded workers of long-tail rights once their labor had already been spent. Naturally, the reaction from the other side grew uglier. A council-backed commentator accused Earth of inflaming class resentment. Finance bloc surrogates argued that unions did not understand post-war macrostructure. Anonymous channels started questioning whether some of Helios's most visible cases had been curated for political sympathy. That last attack forced Adrianne into a harder choice. If she kept her witnesses private, the chamber could later dismiss them as selectively staged. If she exposed them too early, they would become targets before they ever spoke. She chose a middle path that cost sleep and bought integrity. She released only anonymized service categories and policy outcomes, not names. Enough for the public to understand the pattern. Not enough for the machine to isolate 4 individuals before hearing day. That public fight led directly into the next one. In response, someone inside the board leaked a counter-brief alleging that Earth had hidden cost overruns in post-war care for years. The numbers were not fully false. That made them useful. Cornvale sent a priority message within minutes. They're trying to put us on the defensive over budget honesty. They're trying to muddy motive, Adrianne said. Same problem in politics. Then let us solve it the same way. With sequence. She asked Mina and Vera to build a comparison between acknowledged Earth care overruns and the much larger suppressed liabilities the compact would erase. If the board wanted to talk about numbers, Adrianne would make sure the room saw all of them, not only the ones useful to reduction. The sequence that resulted was ugly in exactly the right way. Yes, Earth had run costly, inefficient, human-centered recovery systems in the aftermath of war. It had done so because many of the injuries in question were tied to decisions, alliances, and failures the larger system still refused to cost honestly. Earth had spent more because someone had to keep the damaged alive while liability arguments dragged on for years. That was not fiscal innocence. It was the price of staying morally legible inside a wider structure increasingly addicted to euphemism. 3 cycles before departure, Adrianne gathered the 4 witnesses in Helios Vocational Hall after regular hours. The overhead lights had dimmed into maintenance mode, leaving the therapy rails silver under low illumination. It was not a heroic room. That was why she chose it. Before the hearing, she needed one thing settled. Each of them had to know exactly what part of the truth they were carrying into the chamber. I need all of you to understand the risk, she said. If you go, they will try to reduce you to examples. If you do not go, they will reduce you to statistics. Elias rubbed the inside of one wrist where the memory anchors irritated his skin. What do you need us to do? Tell the truth in a way they cannot reorganize fast enough. Celine gave a dry little exhale. A modest request. Adrianne did not smile. I'm serious. No speeches. No appeals. No summaries of what the war meant to you. Just 3 things. What you did. What happened to your body. What the framework takes now. Mina leaned against the support rail. And if they ask whether the larger system owes us forever, then you let me answer it. Jean looked from one face to the next. I do not want to sound grateful for crumbs. You will not. I also do not want to sound like I think being hurt makes me holy. It does not, Adrianne said. It makes you evidence. That was the moment they all understood the shape of the hearing. Not a tribunal of suffering. A fight over definitions. From witness preparation, Adrianne moved one step deeper into the past. The night before departure, she went down to archive storage where Helios kept the earliest post-war treatment files. Those rooms rarely appeared in public tours. They were too plain, too cold, and too full of the years people prefer to treat as transition rather than history. There she found the first recovery packet ever opened for Adrianne Solis. She had not come for grief. She came for calibration. Systems like the one she was facing thrived when memory became selective or abstract. Tomas's packet was neither. It was ugly, incomplete, and full of delay codes that had since been retired under better language. Acute inhalation injury. Secondary fibrosis progression. Treatment transfer disputed. Priorities shifted under resource review. Stabilization maintained. Définitive intervention pending. The bureaucracy of slow death. Adrianne closed the file and left it in place. She did not need to carry the record with her. She already carried what mattered. The knowledge that the current framework was not an innovation. It was a perfected descendant of smaller, quieter failures that had already killed people after the war had supposedly ended. That memory sharpened her final choice before the chamber. She would not ask the council to see burden recoding as unkind. Unkindness was survivable in politics. She would ask them to see it as familiar. The morning of departure, a final obstacle arrived from within Earth. A sealed recommendation from a fiscal emergency subcommittee advised Adrianne to narrow her hearing demands if the chamber offered limited concessions. Restore some treatment rights. Protect a subset of veteran cases. Leave the compact under modified negotiation. Accept movement on optics and come home with a partial win. It was, in one sense, a reasonable path. It would help some people fast. It would ease government panic. It would also leave the framework alive enough to return in another form. Adrianne took the recommendation to Cornvale and laid it on the table between them. Tell me this is not what you want. He looked at it without touching it. I want Earth breathing room. And I want to know whether you still recognize the cost center you're willing to trade for it. His jaw tightened. You think this is moral weakness? Sometimes it is arithmetic under pressure. No, she said. Moral weakness is using arithmetic under pressure to make betrayal feel mature. He stood and walked to the glass, watching Earth turn beyond the conference pane. If you fail in there, he said, I lose leverage the government loses credit, and the people in your wards still suffer. If I accept this path before I go in, then I fail before anyone else gets a chance. That was the end of the argument because both of them knew it. Corrin did one useful thing before they parted. He authorized release of Earth-side procurement data showing how much post-war medical cost Earth had absorbed while cross-sector liability remained disputed. It was not enough to win on its own. It was enough to keep finance bloc from calling Adrianne naive about budgets without contradiction. When she boarded the shuttle, she carried more than witness packets and internal memos. She carried a structure of proof that reached from a rehabilitation bench on Helios all the way to the polished tables of the Galaxy Council. That mattered because the story she meant to tell was not about pain alone. It was about how institutions move pain from one ledger to another and then claimed the movement itself was wisdom. Before the chamber, there was one more fight to survive. The Recovery Board released a media brief calling burden classification a modernized framework for equitable long-term care. The Reconstruction Finance bloc followed with a statement about responsible recovery and shared sacrifice. Then Council Stability Committee members began speaking on intersector channels about the danger of indefinite post-war dependency models. The message was becoming clear to anyone willing to hear it. Earth was sentimental. Earth was unrealistic. Earth was trying to turn old pain into permanent leverage. That was when Adrianne understood the second battlefield had opened. They were not only changing files. They were changing what the public would feel entitled to say about those files. She agreed to one interview on Earth Public Channel, and one only. The interviewer wanted emotion. Adrianne gave sequence instead. People were injured in a war the larger system still claims was necessary, she said. Now those same people are being moved into a class that reduces treatment, movement, work access, and liability recognition. If someone wants to defend that, they should defend it honestly. Not as medicine, not as sustainability, as what it is. And what is it? The interviewer asked. A discount. The clip spread farther than she expected because truth, when phrased cleanly enough, was harder to bury than policy teams like to admit. The backlash came quickly. 2 ministers inside Earth's Reconstruction Coalition accused her of undermining fiscal negotiations. An Orbital Labor columnist wrote that she was weaponizing the wounded to preserve an inefficient system. A council legal analyst declared on public stream that Earth was resisting a framework that might one day save other species from post-war collapse. Adrianne watched all of it with the patience of someone who knew pressure was information. When an attack line repeated across too many voices too quickly, it meant someone was seeding it. Mina traced one set of media packets back to advisory offices linked with finance bloc affiliates. Elias found that a Stability Committee subcouncil had circulated guidance language 48 hours before the first public statements. Vera flagged a hidden clause in the proposed compact that would suspend ongoing liability review once a population entered certified burden status. That clause was not about care. It was about history. If injuries no longer counted fully as war liabilities, then the systems that had helped cause them could stop paying for them. And if Earth took debt relief in exchange for accepting that shift, then Earth itself would help close the ledger. By the end of the 4th day, Adrianne could finally see the whole machine. The burden framework was a financial instrument disguised as social reform. It reduced future obligations, softened existing liability claims, justified mobility restrictions, and made Earth appear irresponsible if it objected. Better still, from the point of view of its architects, it was tidy. No war crime, no bomb, no detention line, just a category change and a better balance sheet. It might have worked too if they had not pushed it too fast. The person who broke the wall from inside did not look like a hero. She looked like an overworked analyst with a bad shoulder and the habit of checking doorways before sitting down. Her name was Talia Hest, and she asked for Adrianne through an unmonitored legal relay near midnight. They met in an unused hydroponic maintenance corridor on Helios' outer ring because Talia had insisted on physical distance from standard surveillance grids. The corridor smelled faintly of nutrient water and old metal. I have 12 minutes before my absence gets interesting, Talia said. She worked in actuarial modeling for the board. She did not look directly at Adrianne when she spoke. The burden rollout was not only accelerated, it was weighted. Weighted how? Thresholds were calibrated to capture high liability, high visibility, high cost profiles first. Why? Talia finally looked at her. Because if Earth folded under the first wave, the legal precedent would hold before scrutiny organized. Adrianne kept her own voice even. Do you have proof? Talia handed over a storage wafer the size of a fingernail. Predictive exposure runs, pilot notes, internal commentary from finance coordinators, and one draft presentation never meant for public review. What do they call it internally? Talia's mouth thinned. Compression. Adrianne waited. Compression of long-tail war costs through population recoding. There it was. The obscene honesty that power only allowed itself in private. Why come to me? Adrianne asked. My mother was reclassified 2 years ago under an earlier colonial pilot. She stopped treatment because she did not want to bankrupt what was left of our household. Talia swallowed once. 3 months later, they wrote compassionate closure on the case review. She left without asking for protection, which meant she understood too well how little protection existed. Back in the audit suite, Adrianne opened the files with Vera, Mina, Elias, and Celine present. The internal draft presentation was enough to turn a strong suspicion into an indictment. One slide projected comparative war liability exposure before and after burden recoding. Another linked debt restructuring offers to successful pilot adoption. A third explicitly identified Earth as a high-yield case because Earth's public rhetoric around sacrifice could be turned against it if officials resisted sustainability framing. They studied us, Mina said. They priced us, Adrianne answered. The last page mattered most. It described the political challenge of implementation in one blunt line. Need visible Earth compliance figure or recognized Earth authority to neutralize accusations of moral abandonment. Adrianne read that line twice and understood what would happen next. They were coming for her name, not just her files. The leak had done its work. The summons arrived less than 14 hours later. By order of the Galaxy Council Oversight Chamber, Adrianne Solis was commanded to appear for review concerning obstruction of integrated post-war recovery policy, unauthorized interference with a lawful burden harmonization framework, and conduct detrimental to cross-sector stabilization during active reconstruction. It was elegant. She almost admired the honesty hidden inside the structure of it. They were not bringing her in because she had lost. They were bringing her in because she had seen too much while there was still time to matter. Earth's cabinet split fast and ugly over what to do. One bloc wanted to replace her with a calmer envoy. Another argued that removing her now would look like surrender. Corin Vale asked to see her privately and did not waste time. If you go, he said, this stops being administrative. It stopped being administrative when they named the wounded a burden. They will say you made it political. It was political before I entered the room. He leaned forward. There is still a path to partial acceptance. A narrower burden band. Transitional protections. Reduced rollback. We might salvage the fiscal package. Adrianne looked at him for a long moment. Corin, I need you to answer one question honestly. If Earth signs, and 10 years from now, a child studies the post-war settlement, what will that child learn? That Earth protected the people who carried its injuries? Or that Earth sold those people in exchange for a longer payment schedule? He shut his eyes briefly, just once. That is not a fair question. It is the only fair one. Earth kept her, not because the government suddenly found courage in all the right places, but because too many officials now understood that removing Adrianne would look exactly like what the leak board document said it needed. Visible Earth compliance. She spent the next day building a hearing strategy that felt less like advocacy and more like controlled demolition. Her plan was simple in order, not in consequence. First, make the chamber admit what the burden class changed. Then show who it changed. Then prove why it had been built that way. Only after that would she ask the room what kind of future it was about to authorize. She would not begin with morality. That would let them dismiss her as emotional. She would begin with consequences, then design, then motive, then the human cost, once the chamber no longer had a safe place to hide. Before departure, she walked alone through Helios Lower Ward one last time. People were still in treatment, still waiting for reapproval, still asking clerks whether paperwork would reach them before the next therapy lapse. The machinery of harm did not pause because a hearing had been scheduled. If anything, it pressed faster, hoping to make reversal harder. At the edge of the mobility corridor, John Merrick was adjusting his transfer braces in silence. "You can still stay behind," Adrianne said. "No, they will look at you and think in headlines. They already do. I cannot protect you from that." He worked the strap tighter. "I'm not going because I need them to feel something," he said. "I'm going because they've been allowed to say what I am without hearing what I did." That was the exact right answer. Celine found Adrianne outside the departure lock with a medical kit in hand. "They will try to split the issue," she said. "Care on one side, money on the other." "I know. Then eat before you go in there and mistake fury for clarity." Adrianne almost smiled. The shuttle to the council district moved through quiet space while Earth fell away behind them, and the witnesses sat in a line that did not feel ceremonial. It felt like a convoy of another kind. John reviewed his travel denial and service history. Celine closed her eyes and practiced stillness. Elias wrote memory anchors on his wrist in small, neat script. Mina disassembled. The logic tree of the compact one last time, not because it would change, but because understanding was her form of steadiness. Adrianne did not rehearse phrases. She reviewed structure. First, make them admit what the burden class changed. Second, show whom it changed. Third, prove the connection to debt and liability. Fourth, force the chamber to choose whether it was reviewing a policy or authorizing a future. The Galaxy Council district had been designed by minds that believed architecture could produce moral authority. Every line curved on purpose. Every hall softened sound. Every surface reflected order without warmth. The oversight chamber was smaller than Adrianne expected, which made it more dangerous. Smaller rooms let systems pretend that directness and fairness were the same thing. Counselor Seared Thane presided from the central bench, gray-robed and perfectly measured, with the expression of a man who never needed to raise his voice because every mechanism around him had long ago learned his preferences. To his right sat the Recovery Board delegation, led by Loras Vin and two medical economists. To his left sat Reconstruction Finance representatives and Stability Committee observers. Earth had its council bench, but no one standing there could know the case the way Adrianne did. That was why they needed her and feared her in equal measure. Seared Thane opened with courtesy sharpened into a blade. Administrator Adrianne Solis, you appear before this chamber in connection with obstruction of integrated recovery policy and conduct capable of destabilizing post-war reconstruction across multiple sectors. Do you understand the basis of review? Yes, Adrianne said. She kept her voice plain. Grand rooms loved to turn feeling into spectacle. Plain speech resisted that. The first hour went exactly as she expected. The board described burden harmonization as necessary modernization. Finance bloc witnesses spoke of aggregate strain, unsustainable exposure, and the duty of advanced civilizations to discipline grief with structure. Stability Committee analysts warned of long-tail unrest if post-war dependency remained politically insulated from reform. They were smart enough not to insult the wounded directly. That would have made the room easy. Instead, they insulted them by implication and called the insult realism. Adrianne let them build the frame they wanted. It was stronger that way. People trusted traps more when they had watched the other side assemble them patiently. Seared Thane turned to her. Administrator, do you deny that long-term recovery systems must sometimes reclassify populations in order to preserve wider equilibrium? I deny that you were discussing equilibrium. That caused the first small shift in the room. Then what were we discussing? Thane asked. A cost transfer. The board objected. Finance councils rose. The chamber restored order. Adrianne waited until silence returned. You may call it harmonization if you prefer, she said. The effect is the same. A war creates damage. That damage creates long-term obligations. The new framework recodes some of the people carrying that damage into a class that lowers those obligations. The costs do not vanish. They move. They move away from the ledgers that caused them and onto Earth and the bodies already paying. Seared Thane folded his hands. That is an argument, not proof. Adrianne touched her display panel. Then let us begin with proof. She started not with memos or dead instruments, but with the burden class itself. That was deliberate. Before the chamber could argue about motives, it had to admit the practical effect. What did the category change? What did people lose when it changed? Movement, treatment continuity, work eligibility, reimbursement, liability status. Each category was simple enough for any listener in the public gallery to understand which mattered. Hearings were not one only in the chamber. They were one in the minds of those deciding later which story sounded true. Loras Vin tried to regain technical cover. Some rights remain available under managed review. Managed by whom? Adrianne asked. Integrated oversight bodies. Accountable to whom? To the council framework. And responsible for the cost of care? He hesitated. There it was. A pause small enough for procedure, large enough for meaning. Shared across the system, he said. Adrianne did not press that point yet. Press too early and the room hardens. Let the cracks show first. She called John Merrick as the first witness. He spoke with no flourish, which made every line stronger. He described the filtration spine at Dorsa Array, the gas pressure alarms, the families in the lower block, the choice not to leave when the collapse warning came because the auto-control chain had already failed. Then he described Helios, the braces, Titan Yard, and a message informing him that he could no longer travel for the procedure meant to keep the possibility of standing alive. Under the new framework, board counsel asked, you remain eligible for localized support. John answered without heat. Localized support does not reconnect the nerves. Titan Yard does. That does not prove intent to harm. No, John said. It proves you wrote a rule from far away and expected distance to count as reason. Adrianne watched the gallery then, not the bench. Some truths landed first outside official faces. Celine Ward followed. She gave the chamber her field hospital in spare language. Shared triage, species-blind emergency order, improvised anesthesia, 8 days without full power. Then she described the new pain management restrictions and reduced therapy access under the burden label. Finance Council tried the line Adrianne had anticipated. Dr. Ward, is it possible your treatment regime reflects unusually high resource intensity for limited functional recovery? Celine looked at him with a physician's professional tiredness. My hands tremble because I spent days cutting people out of contaminated suits and keeping circulation alive with damaged equipment. If you mean I'm costly now, yes. If you mean that makes the cost less your responsibility, no. Mina Torv and Elias Rowe completed the first human wall Adrianne needed. One spoke for labor stripped after service. The other spoke for memory treated as inefficiency after command under fire. By then, Adrianne had established the first point. The category was not symbolic. It changed movement, treatment, work, and standing in ways the chamber could no longer describe as abstract. Only then did she move to the design. She introduced the internal board memos in layers. Pilot language, threshold calibration, population recoding, liability compression. Earth is a high-yield test case. The chamber objected, then admitted, objected again, then admitted more. Internal documents had a bad habit of making elegant public theories look embarrassingly literal. Seared Thane himself intervened. Administrator Solis, are you asserting that this framework was built not primarily to improve recovery management, but to reduce war-linked liabilities through recoding? Yes, that is a grave accusation. It is a grave mechanism. You let that sit. Show the chamber where finance enters. Adrianne almost thanked him. He had asked for the next step himself. Mina's tree came up on the main display. Not raw enough to confuse. Clean enough to follow. Reconstruction Stabilization Compact, terms on one side. Burden reclassification categories on the other. Between them stood the legal valve where war-affected status narrowed and reimbursement exposure dropped. Adrianne walked the chamber through it in the plainest possible sequence. If Earth accepts the compact, debt pressure eases in the short term. If burden classification stands, movement, treatment, work access, and status stay narrowed. Once that status stays narrowed, liability totals fall in the medium term. When liability totals fall, some allied systems pay less than existing chains would otherwise require. If burden status spreads, the model becomes normal. And you claim these were intentionally linked? Sir Thane asked. No, Adrianne said. I claim they were engineered to arrive together. That sentence entered the public record and stayed there. The board's lead economist countered with graphs of overall post-war strain. Finance Council spoke of shared sacrifice. Stability Committee witnesses warned of collapse if every system insisted on unlimited historical accounting. It was a smart defense. It took the specific and tried to drown in scale. Adrianne had prepared for that. She did not argue that sacrifice should be unlimited. She argued that categories should be honest. A civilization may decide. It cannot afford certain obligations, she said. That is ugly, but at least it is clear. What this framework does is worse. It claims to preserve dignity while reducing responsibility. It moves the burden from the ledger that caused it to the bodies already carrying it. Sir Thane's voice remained mild. You speak as though any effort to organize post-war care is an act of abandonment. No, Adrianne said. I speak as though your framework is abandonment dressed for committee. The room tightened. Thane looked to his notes, then back to her. How far, in your view, does gratitude extend? A year? 10 years? A generation? Is there any point at which mourning may yield to structure? There it was. The most dangerous question of the day, because it sounded almost philosophical. The wrong answer would make Adrianne seem naive. The safe answer would concede the field. She answered with the coldest truth she had. This is not about gratitude. Gratitude is for ceremonies. Responsibility is for systems. You praised the wounded when the war still needed heroes. You renamed them a burden when the invoices arrived. No one spoke for several seconds. Even the air in the chamber seemed to hold itself still. Thane broke the silence carefully. That is rhetoric. Adrianne activated the last set of internal files. No, she said. This is rhetoric. On the display appeared a draft messaging packet from the Finance Bloc Advisory Office. It recommended public phrases for defending the compact if opposition centered on decorated service members and visible civilian rescuers. The language advised emphasizing shared burden, resilience narratives, and the emotional unsustainability of selective moral categories. In other words, they had already planned how to soften the appearance of calling heroes expensive. The gallery reacted first. Not outrage exactly. Something more dangerous. Recognition. Board counsel objected on grounds of authenticity. Mina Tor verified the signature chain. Vera Kellen verified routing history. Elias Rowe, who had anchored himself with notes across his wrist so he would not lose the sequence, testified to the operational consistency between the burden, rollout, and the liability compression map. By the time the chamber paused for recess, the case had shifted. Adrianne had shown what the framework changed. She had shown who it changed. She had shown how the financial design sat behind it. Now the chamber could no longer pretend this was only a reform dispute. They had wanted to review a modernization argument. Instead, they were staring at a method for shrinking the moral cost of war without saying so aloud. During recess, Earth Council wanted Adrianne to rest. She refused and went instead to the side gallery where her witnesses sat together under quiet supervision. John looked tired. Celine looked furious in the controlled way physicians reserved for institutional stupidity. Elias was recentering his notes. Mina was already pulling the next threads. It is not enough, Mina said as Adrianne approached. I know. They can still narrow this to technical overreach and bad messaging. I know. What is left? John asked. Adrianne leaned against the wall beside them. The precedent. Celine understood first. Make it bigger than Earth. Yes. That was the final turn she had been holding back. As long as the chamber believed this was about Earth's feelings, Earth's debt, and Earth's wounded, they could still isolate the damage. Adrianne had to make them see what would happen if the model survived Earth. The second half began with Stability Committee testimony about future harmonization potential across affected systems. Adrianne listened without expression. Sometimes the people defending a dangerous framework gave you the weapon if you let them talk long enough. When the witness finished, Adrianne asked one question. If this model is sound, would you recommend it for other post-war populations beyond Earth? The witness hesitated. Then, because retreat would expose too much, he answered, under appropriate review, yes. That one yes changed the room. Adrianne stood. Then this hearing is not about whether Earth is resisting mature reconstruction. It is about whether the Council will authorize a future in which any species may use war injury, civilian trauma, and long-tail disability as grounds for reduced citizenship once the fighting is over. No objection came fast enough to stop the sentence from landing. She pushed before they could recover. If that future becomes law here, then every system in this chamber will learn the same lesson. Your dead may still be honored. Your visibly heroic may still be celebrated. But your difficult survivors, your long recoveries, your damaged workers, your people who need care without producing perfect returns, all of them may be renamed into a cheaper class. That was the moment the chamber stopped being only about Earth. Representatives in the side tiers began conferring openly. Some had no affection for Earth. Some had voted against Earth positions more often than not. It did not matter. They could all imagine what burden recoding would do once normalized. Finance Bloc tried to rush a procedural narrowing motion. Stability observers pushed for technical committee review. Seared Thane denied immediate narrowing, which told Adrianne he had seen the danger too. If he moved too bluntly now, he would appear to be protecting design rather than reviewing it. The witnesses returned for one final sequence, not longer than necessary. Adrianne asked each of them only one question. What did you do during the war, and what does the new framework call you now? John Merrick answered, I kept air moving through a mixed civilian block after the control chain failed. It calls me a burden. Celine Ward answered, I ran a field hospital for whoever reached the table in time. It calls me a burden. Elias Rowe answered, I held a defensive line long enough for carriers to clear. It calls me a burden. Mina Torvansverid. I stayed with a reactor because leaving would have killed people who never knew my name. It calls me a burden. No performance. No theirs. Just sequence. Adrianne turned back to the bench. This is what the chamber must decide. Not whether budgets exist. Not whether care is finite. Whether the larger system gets to hide its debts by changing what it calls the people who absorb them. Seared Thane looked older then, or perhaps only less protected by certainty. What outcome do you seek, he asked. It was the question she had been working toward from a first day in Helios records. Immediate suspension of burden classification pending full review. Restoration of war-affected status for all Earth cases pulled under the pilot. Preservation of liability chains. Independent inquiry into the compact and the timing of its linkage to recovery recoding. And a ruling that no post-war population may be reduced in civic standing through budgetary reclassification without direct legislative approval. The board protested the scale. Finance Council called it opportunistic overreach. Stability Committee observers warned of systemic shock. Adrianne did not argue with any of them. She had already built the more dangerous pressure. The room now had to think beyond its own comfort. The decision did not come quickly. Power preferred time. Time allowed it to regroup, negotiate, soften, and, if possible, bury. But the chamber could not adjourn into private delay without looking exactly like what Adrianne had described. Not now. Not with public feeds carrying the hearing into dozens of systems already wondering whether their own damaged populations might be next. When Seared Thane finally spoke, his voice was steady, but no longer frictionless. This chamber finds that the current burden framework, as applied under the Earth pilot, raises substantial questions regarding the interaction of recovery administration, liability compression, and reconstruction negotiation. That was not justice. It was the beginning of institutional fear. Adrianne would take it. He continued. Effective immediately, implementation of post-conflict burden classification under the current pilot is suspended. Existing Earth cases are restored on an interim basis to prior war-affected status, pending full review. The Reconstruction Stabilization Compact is stayed under conflict examination. A cross-sector inquiry is authorized into the relationship between burden recoding and long-tail war obligations. The room shifted, but he was not done. Further, this chamber finds that no population may have war-derived civic status reduced through administrative harmonization, where such reduction materially alters liability recognition without direct council authorization following open review. There it was. The precedent had been cut off where it mattered most. Not all the way dead. Systems like these rarely died from one blow, but wounded publicly in a place that mattered. Finance Council immediately lodged challenge motions. Board delegates requested temporary narrowing. Stability Committee members argued that the chamber was risking future recovery reform. Seared Thane denied some, deferred others, and in doing so revealed the one fact Adrianne needed most. He understood that to protect the framework now would stain the chamber itself. The hearing closed without triumph. That was right. Real victories at that scale usually sounded more like exhausted paperwork than music. The ruling had landed. The next question was whether it would reach real lives back on Helios. Outside the chamber, public streams were already reframing the story. Not as Earth sentiment against realism. As a fight over whether advanced systems could manage the wounded by changing what they were called. John Merrick sat down on a corridor bench the moment the secure doors sealed behind them. Celine put both hands flat against the wall and breathed once. Elias looked at the notes on his wrist and then slowly crossed them out, line by line. Mina, who trusted outcomes least, said the thing none of them wanted to say first. They will come back another way. Yes, Adrianne said. That did not weaken the victory. It made it honest. Earth's response arrived in layers. Public relief, then caution. Then the quieter recognition that Adrianne had preserved something larger than a treatment system. She had prevented Earth from signing away its own language for what had been done to it. Corin Vale met her in the secure transit corridor. You made this harder for everyone, he said. Yes. And saved us from something we might have signed without naming. Also, yes. I still have to rebuild a budget. And I still have to rebuild lives. The shuttle back to Earth orbit felt longer than the trip out. Perhaps because the pressure had changed shape. No longer the pressure of imminent defeat. The pressure of unfinished work. Helios recovery. Complex received them without ceremony. Adrianne preferred that. Real institutions did not improve because a corridor lined up and applauded. They improved when clerks changed fields back, when treatment lanes reopened, when travel gates reset, and when the first person who had been told no was told yes again for the right reason. Vera Kellen met them at records with eyes brighter than they had been in days. The restoration orders are already spreading, she said. Slow in some colonial nodes, but real. Show me. She did. One by one, files were reverting. War-affected citizen. Full movement review reinstated. Treatment continuity protected pending individual reassessment. Liability chain preserved under inquiry hold. John Merrick stared at his own slate, as if it had become untrustworthy from overuse. Travel gate reopened, he said softly. Celine received her treatment restoration 3 minutes later. Mina's workboard re-entered active review under prior status. Elias recovered specialist movement privileges that would let him pursue the memory reconstruction program he had been denied. None of them celebrated loudly. That too was right. People who had learned how quickly systems could reverse themselves did not waste strength on easy joy. Later, when the immediate flood had settled into the slower work of implementation, Adrianne walked the lower ring alone. The same corridors, the same lift rails, the same therapy suites. Different air. Not because Helios had become safe. It had not. Not because Earth had won a clean ending. It had not. Debt still existed. Pressure still existed. Finance blocks still wanted relief more than truth. Stability committees still preferred elegant language over hard memory. What had changed was narrower and more durable. A line had held. At Ward 3, she paused outside the mobility bay where John would leave the next day for Titan Yard under restored clearance. Through the glass, she saw him practicing transfer motion with a therapist, exhausted and furious and alive inside the effort. At neural care, Celine argued calmly with a physician over her own medication threshold, which meant she was well enough to be difficult again. At vocational services, Mina was already reviewing technical placement options as though she had no intention of wasting the opening. Elias sat in memory therapy with a board of anchors beside him, rebuilding sequence instead of defending his right to try. They were not symbols. Adrianne reminded herself of that again. That had been the point all along. Systems survived by turning people into categories. Earth stayed difficult by insisting the categories answer back. She took the long route to the observation ring before ending her shift. Earth filled the black below, blue and white, and patient in the indifferent way planets always seem to be. Adrianne rested one hand against the window rail and let the silence settle. For a few moments, she allowed herself to think again of Tomas. Not as a wound, as a standard. He had survived the war and died in the part that followed, when the public looked away and the efficient language began its work. The system that failed him had never called itself cruel. It had called itself realistic. Perhaps that was why today's victory mattered to her as much as it did. Not because every wound had been honored, because one structure built to rename wounds into lesser obligations had been forced into the light before it became ordinary. Her wrist unit signaled, a message from seared Thane, transmitted through formal channel, and therefore likely visible to more people than either of them would have chosen if candor were the goal. The Chamber's inquiry will proceed. Opposition will reorganize. You understand this? She read it once, then replied, yes. So will Earth. His answer came a full minute later. That is becoming clear. She did not know whether it was respect, annoyance, or warning. In power, those things often traveled together. The following cycle brought no miracle, only work. That, too, was a kind of grace. Helios intake desks processed restoration requests. Colonial nodes challenged delayed compliance. Earth Council prepared for the inquiry. Media pressure turned against some of the compact's architects. Families who had spent days wondering whether treatment or movement rights would disappear overnight now had breathing room, if not certainty. A father from South Meridian Colony returned to thank the clerk who had first explained the reclassification to him. John's transfer team reassembled his route. Celine's revised care plan no longer treated pain as an accounting inconvenience. Mina's new placement review included the reactor systems she actually knew. Elias laughed once, unexpectedly, when a therapist reminded him that memory work could still count as courage. By the end of the week, Earth had not become stronger in the easy sense. Its debt had not vanished. Its enemies had not converted. The larger system had not apologized. What Earth had done was harder and more dangerous. It had refused the invitation to stabilize itself by accepting a lie about its own wounded. That refusal changed the balance of the story the Galactic Council had hoped to tell. They had wanted a lesson about maturity. Earth had turned it into a warning about convenience. They had wanted a framework that made difficult survivors cheaper. Earth had made the framework look like what it was. They had wanted compliance from a recognized Earth authority. Instead, they had received Adrianne Solis, who understood that systems rarely broke first at their strongest points. They broke where they began mistaking renamed obligations for erased ones. On her last pass, through Helios' lower ring, before sleeping, Adrianne stopped at the public memorial wall near Rehabilitation Transit. It was a modest thing. Too modest, perhaps, for the number of names it held. Earth did not have room for grandeur everywhere the dead deserved it. Some of the names belonged to people who had died during the war. Some belonged to those who had survived long enough to enter the quieter accounting afterward. Adrianne stood there long enough to read a few lines without trying to read them all. No one could carry all of it every day and remain useful. Behind her, the complex kept moving. Doors opened. Carts rolled. Nurses changed stations. A maintenance crew argued mildly over an air filter. Life, imperfect and procedural and unpoetic, continued doing what life always did when given half a chance. That was enough for her. Not peace. Not justice in any complete sense. Enough. Because the most dangerous thing the larger system had nearly accomplished was not a budget adjustment or a legal precedent. It had almost convinced Earth to believe that the people who came out of war damaged were a secondary problem, a class to be managed after the meaningful history was over. Earth had not accepted that story. And because it had not, something larger than one hearing had shifted. Humanity remained difficult to govern not only when it was armed, not only when it was proud, not only when it was winning. Humanity remained difficult because it did not easily agree that loyalty expired when usefulness did. Adrianne left the memorial wall and went back toward the lift, tired down to the bone and steadier for it. There'd be inquiries, retaliation in subtler forms, new language trying to recover old intentions. She knew that, but the line had held at the point where it mattered. The wounded were not cheaper now because someone powerful had renamed them. Earth had refused the trade. And somewhere far beyond the bright chambers of the Council, other systems were learning a lesson they had not intended to learn from humanity. Do not assume a species is only dangerous when it strikes. Some become most dangerous when you ask them to abandon their own, and they answer no. If Adrianne Solis proved anything, it was this. Humanity is not measured only by how fiercely it fights, but by how faithfully it stands beside those who paid the price. The galaxy could call Earth's wounded a burden. It could bury truth under procedure, debt, and polished language. But in the end, it was forced to face something far harder to erase. A species that refuses to abandon its own. If this story stayed with you, please take a moment to like the video, share it with someone who still believes loyalty matters, and subscribe to the channel for more science fiction stories where humanity stands its ground when the galaxy pushes back. And before you go, tell me in the comments, what hit you the hardest in this story? Adrianne's courage, the system's cruelty, or the moment Earth refused to betray its wounded?